Richard's on. He's got stories he can tell, but I wanted to carry over from last week, and I may try to get a hold of Saul Miller and see if he'd like to join us again. But we got into a little bit of debate with the use of nicknames, and Morris and Saul, they sort of hashed over the debate of whether or not Coma was a good nickname to use with a player. And when I talked to Morris after that in the afternoon, and the player's name was Dave Christensen from the Jets, it really made sense. And I think at the NHL level, you can have a positive nickname or a negative nickname, and they just sort of seem to fit what the team wants. And so Dave Christensen's name, Coma, it obviously meant he had some blank moments on the ice where he might have turned the puck over or done some things that the people scratch their head, but it became his nickname. And the debate was, it was, well, not a positive thing to do and wondering what it did, but I can certainly live with it at that level. Let those boys figure it out. Now, Rick Puttick is on, and I was going to get Rick to mention he shared some great stories with me about his use of nicknames and some of them that resonated. And before I turn it over to Rick, my nickname as a player, and I had both a good one and a bad one, and I didn't mind either one, but I sure like Cozy better than Crow's Ass. So, so your last name sort of fits into it. Now, Rick, later on in the presentation, I was going to get Kim to show her Zoom session and talk about her ability to do skill development online, which she did last week, and she said she had a pretty good session, and I sort of invited her to share that with us. But Rick, would you begin the nickname talk and take off from there? And I'd be curious later on about everybody's nicknames, if they had any, and if you've got any other nickname stories to add, go ahead. Rick Puttick, please.
Thanks, Wally. I don't know if it's that grand of a story, but as I mentioned last week in the session, I made a point very early on in my coaching of introducing the concept of nicknames to every group. I just felt from some of my learning back in the day that it would help foster team togetherness. So we went through exercises early in the season to establish, I hope, would be positive nicknames. And quite frankly, back in those days, we weren't as concerned about how things were interpreted as we are. We're very much more sensitive today to it. So it can take on a different connotation. But, more recently, I had a female bantam team where I had two particular D partners. One was named Michaela and the other was named Kate. But they were really good buddies, if you would, on the ice, off the ice, on the bench. They always played together. Uncommon to me, coming from the male side of the game, they actually smiled and danced and had a good time together when they were on the ice. Took me a while to adjust to that and find it as a positive as opposed to a negative. But with their names, they were so close that people started calling them Mac and Cheese. And it's kind of a unique name for that pair, but it has stuck with them, and it's still with them whenever they're together, and they're still good friends. I don't see them very much any longer because I'm not coaching them, but it's just one of those positive stories that came out of it. And I, as I alluded to earlier, in the 80s and 90s in particular, when I started coaching, we weren't as sensitive to the politically correct side of things. So nicknames were just interpreted for what they were, I think, is probably the best way to put it. And I acknowledge that today we need to be just a little more cautious with what we're calling people and what's behind it. Make sure that it isn't interpreted in a negative fashion. But I've always been a big fan of them. Most of them were just adding the EY or the OER, the cozy or the putter or the whatever. One of my teammates nicknamed me Peter Puck once, which I took to be a compliment, but some people may even take that to be a negative connotation. So, but I still, even in my work life today, I still use the nickname concept with coworkers that I'm particularly associated with on an ongoing basis.
Rick, I'm just going to remind everybody, Tim suggested if you had anything to offer at any time to do a raised hand. So the speaker, I don't think can see raised hands, but just relative to that, Sammy, I don't recall working with the national women's team, and it could be memory loss for me, the use of nicknames. And I don't know if you had one or you remember anything related to growing up, but go ahead.
Yeah, within the women's team, there certainly was a lot of nicknames, and the two nickname givers. So that also is a whole nother, part of the dynamic is who becomes the nickname giver and how does it stick. So the two nickname givers were Vicky Sanahara and then Jillian Ferrari, and both super respected within the community. And the nicknames that stuck tended to be tamer. But like Jillian Ferrari was Fur Dog, Vicky was Puppy, everybody. I mean, Apsy was Apu after the Simpsons character. Everybody seemed to Jana Hefford was Hef, or Sheffy because she also cooked a lot. Everybody seemed to have one. I had a unique name in that my real name is Samantha, so Sammy was kind of a nickname. And I think people tended to gravitate towards that. So I think, every situation was different, but there can be some very harsh nicknames. And that's where I think it sometimes crosses the line when the person doesn't want it. And how do you get out of it? So that, when they're just light and easy, I don't feel like that's a discussion point. But when it is on the verge of bullying, how do you, and maybe Jordan can talk a little bit more about that because he's in the school environment where that's more prevalent. How do you get out of that? You're called fatty, or you're called two eyes, or you're called whatever, and that sticks with everybody. So perhaps that's the discussion point.
Good. I'm curious, just about everybody, any nickname stories, good or bad, that they learned from and would do differently today. Now, he's managed to get on, and Morris used a nickname that created a little bit of debate within our group. And I know I talked to people after about it. And in talking to Morris, I really appreciated the way that nickname was used in that context of that particular team. So I'm glad Morris is on. So Kim, go ahead.
I was just going to mention I didn't get a lot of nicknames when I played, but when in high school I had two nicknames, and I'm still in touch with a lot of my teammates from Leaside because they're all coaches now. But apparently my nicknames were Chainsaw and Hollywood, and I have no idea why either one. And now I'm too embarrassed to ask because they obviously called me that and still call me that, and I have no idea why I was called either one of those things. So that's just a little funny tidbit. I guess the only challenge I've had with nicknames is I've had so many sisters over the years. And so often nicknames are kind of a play on the last name. And then when I keep getting the younger sister after the older sister, I can't call them by the same nickname. Like, for example, I've had two sisters whose last names are Van Den Oodler. Like, clearly you need to shorten that. So we call them VDO, but then I called the older sister VDO, and then I couldn't call the second one VDO because I associated with the other one. So it's a good problem to have. But I find in girls hockey, they all have the same name. Like, you get on a team and there's 4 Abbies or there's 6 Ashleys, all spelled differently, of course. So it's challenging. Maddies, I had 2 Maddies. I've had only one team ever that didn't have a multiple first name in the history of coaching. So often the last name becomes the key for for the nicknames. But yeah, I have no idea where my two high school nicknames came from, so I'm too embarrassed to ask. So I'll just take it and go with it.
I don't. You recall the last week, Kim? You made mention of the timing as a coach and selection of nicknames, and with Richard on, and not who didn't hear it last week. I wonder if you could repeat the points you brought up before we turn to Matt.
Sure. The point I brought up last week is that when you've coached players for multiple years, and someone like Matt, who's got them for 4 or 5 years in university, would certainly know this, is the incoming players don't have nicknames yet, or at least not nicknames that you've provided them. And so we try very hard early in the season to minimize the use of anyone's nickname so as to not make anyone feel out of place, right? So especially at the junior level, you can have quite a bit of turnover from year to year. It's not uncommon to have at least half the team turnover from year to year. And so if you're calling 6 or 7 players by their nicknames and being all buddy in training camp for the first month, and simply calling those other players by their first name or their last name, it's a potential way, it's not inclusive, I guess, is the best way of putting it. So, it's funny when you go back to their real name and they don't respond because you haven't called them their first name in 3 years. But it's a way of evening the playing field, making everyone feel more comfortable.
Matt Holberg.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Kim was saying, and I agree with what Saul said last week about just being very careful. It's pretty dangerous just as a coach to right off the bat in the first couple of weeks start using the same nickname that you hear the other players calling that particular player, because you don't know how it came up, what the circumstances were. Even though it might sound completely innocuous, there might be a story behind it that is either inappropriate or certainly that the player doesn't like at all. And what I've done a couple of times, because you hear it, you can't help but hear it on the ice or on the bench or around the team. And when there's been a time when I've sort of wondered about it, when I have my player meetings, of course, with my assistant coach present, I might ask the player. I don't ask them how the nickname arrived. I just ask them how they feel about it and whether it's something that they're comfortable with, because they may not feel comfortable going to their teammates and saying, I don't like this. But there's been a couple of times when I've gone back to the captains in a respectful way and said, look, this isn't coming from the player, but I don't like the sound of this nickname, and I think you guys better pick a new one. So I'm not putting her in a tough spot with her teammates. We're kind of resolving the problem behind the scenes. But I'd say in 12 years, that's happened probably about 5 or 6 times. And I think as a coach, I think it's good to come up with your own nickname. And most of the nicknames that I've come up with players are ones that just riff off their name. So again, adding an S or an IE at the end, it's pretty simple. And I think, but reserving, calling them by their proper name for the first little while and waiting till they get comfortable with you and vice versa, I think, as Kim mentioned, is completely appropriate. And then I think as that comfort level grows and the trust factor grows, then I think that's okay. And the nickname that the coach could have for the player could be, a little bit different than what the players have for each other. And I've even had players, I've even had rookies arrive and take ownership right out of the gate. Like before Queens players are able, or myself are able to provide them with a nickname, they'll come up and say, this is what I've been called in the past. And if you're going to call me something nickname wise, I want this to stick. So they actually take ownership in it right away, which kind of helps. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And then there's also been other times where I've known what the players call a player. I've known from talking to the player that she's comfortable with it. It's not a problem. And as a coach, I find that actually is a pretty useful tool to keep that in your back pocket. So you might call her by her normal name, 99% of the time, but there could be a moment where some levity is required or some special attentions required or whatever. And then I'll pull out the nickname in front of the whole team, and it just sort of lightens the mood. So I know we had a player a number of years ago. Her nickname was Cookie. There was nothing bad about it. I talked to her about it. I always called her by her first name, but there was a time in the dressing room when things were a little tense, and I called her Cookie, and it just sort of lightened the mood, right? The team couldn't believe that I called her that, right? So I think you can actually use it positively in that respect. But I knew ahead of time that she wouldn't mind, and I knew that the positive effect it could have. The last thing I'll mention, or two other things actually. One quick story. There was a player that we had. Her first name was Carrie, but everyone always called her by this particular nickname. And she was, I was on the bench, so she was in front of me, sitting on the bench watching the play. And so her back was to me, and she wasn't the next one up. But something happened on the ice, and I wanted her to get on the ice really, really quickly. And I started yelling, "Okay, Carrie, Carrie, Carrie!" And she wasn't turning around. She wasn't moving at all. Carrie! And I ran down, and I was basically in her ear. And by then, the line change had actually, the next D pairing had gone out, and it was lost. And I tapped her on the shoulder, and I said, "Didn't you hear me?" And she goes, "What? No." And she goes, "Nobody calls me Carrie." I said, "Well, did you hear me yelling Carrie?" She goes, "I thought you were talking to someone on the ice, like carry the puck." Right? So you actually sort of have to be aware of that. They actually will start to tune out their own name if they've been called a nickname for so long. And I had to work on that with her, right? In terms of, okay, like there's actually a disadvantage to ignoring that as well. So I think that there's a time and place, and there's certainly some good usage to it. The last thing I'll mention is it's a two-way street, and I'd be interested to get your feedback on this, because certainly every rookie, when they come in with us, they'll right away they'll call me Coach Matt, maybe Coach Holmberg, or just Coach. And I'm okay with any one of them. But it's interesting over the course of 4 or 5 years how, without me saying anything, that'll start to transform to Matt. And like a year or two ago, I was talking to one of our 4th or 5th year players, and she just referred to me as Homeby. And that's a nickname I've never had, and it's one I'd never heard of. But it's clear to me that some of the vets had started to shorten it even to that, right? And she was one of our captains, and I felt familiar around her, but it sort of struck me as a bit odd, and was one of the first times where it was a reverse situation, where the players themselves, and I hope it was a situation where they felt comfortable enough, but without asking me or really, I mean, obviously just a riff off my name, but so I thought that was kind of an interesting, and I could see where that could be a bit of a problem in terms of a respect issue. I guess you'd have to be pretty comfortable with the situation, but it's certainly happy to get your thoughts on the reverse situation about the players nicknaming the coach.
Morris, you started this last week, and I'm glad we got her going.
Matthew, boy, that was a couple of interesting pieces there. That's it was quite funny that she actually didn't respond to her real name. That's a classic story, and yet it's understandable, and so a good piece. One, I wanted to say thanks for anybody that logged in last week and listened. I love delivering that talk, and what's cool is every time I deliver it, I get feedback on how to improve it, and so I didn't think there was a negative side to nicknames. I thought it was nicknames could really be used in a positive way, and but so I'm going to give some attention to that. Also, Kim had mentioned something around she's about her thinking, and actually there's been lots of work done on this, how people are divided into 4 different groups, and it's a piece I'm going to add to this, and that we actually, these groups are different personality types. But what I've seen in it is they actually like to listen, or they actually like specific words better than others. And it's based on a king, warrior, lover, magician. I'm not sure if anybody's ever read the book. It's a good one. And I'm going to add this piece in because actually people like to because when we speak in the language that group actually speaks, the trust bond is built bigger and deeper. And then actually when they like to be listened a certain way too. And when they're listened that way, they feel respected, and the trust bond grows further yet. So it's a piece I'm going to add to this, and although it goes pretty deep. You know what? I'm going to just finish. I'm going to get going to work. There's two pieces though. One is that in Winnipeg, originally when we came from Houston to Winnipeg, one of our defensemen, who had been there for quite a long time, his nickname was Buzzard, and it was Buzzard. Wow! And so I did not call him that for a long time, and then I always called him Barry, and then I finally asked somebody, why is he called Buzzard? And they said, well, one time he got into this situation with somebody else, and he took his stick up in the air and he whacked the guy on the head as he was down on the ice. He gave it to him, and somehow the guys interpreted this as like a buzzard coming in, and for the this hit on the. So it was kind of it had, I thought, a real negative connotation to it, and then as I got to play with him, I realized that actually the nickname fit pretty good. But then I went over and I asked him. I said one day, I just said, "Hey, are you okay if I call you Buzzard?" And he said, "Oh yeah, everybody calls me Buzzard." No, okay. So actually, I requested for permission first because we were just becoming new teammates, and he said, "Oh yeah." So it was strange, even though the nickname had him whacking somebody with a stick. He didn't carry a negative connotation with it because it's who he was. He whacked just about everybody. And then one last little piece was that it was funny how a nickname one time generated us a goal, because I was playing with LA at the time, and the puck came up the boards. We were playing against Winnipeg, and Randy Carlisle got the puck, and his nickname was Kitty, short for Kitty Carlisle. Why he ever got Kitty, I don't know. But it was Kit. And Bernie Nichols, who I was playing with LA, so the puck came up to right about the hash marks in the boards, and Randy got it, and he went to pass it, and Bernie actually said Kitty, and Kitty Carlisle, I couldn't believe it, passed it straight to Bernie Nichols, like right out of the tape. And it was funny because he actually kind of did a double take. He passed it, and then when he saw who he'd pass it to, he kind of went like this, and Bernie got it, and he walked right in and scored. And Bernie paid a price later on because Randy chopped him across the arm pretty good. But it was interesting how the nickname was used to actually get the puck from the other team. So it's going to finish on that story. Hey, any questions from last week? Or
No, I just wanted to mention, Morris, I talked to Cal Botterill at length about last week's session, and I'm hoping to get both Cal and Saul on again. And Cal was going to go into the nicknames concept and his historical experience in sports psychology with that. He was quite intrigued by it, and he may join us down the road, and if we can make a formal arrangement to have him and Saul on, that would be a pretty exciting duo. My concern with not concern, but my wish with both of them is finding out how times have changed in terms of their industry and what their perception of things that are going on now and how they've changed down the road. Richard, go ahead. Your hands up.
thanks.
Thanks. I never used players' nicknames that they gave each other. I always felt, I take that teacher approach because that's my background, that I wanted to keep that distance between, particularly with the older players. I mean, the younger ones, I remember coaching AAA, Bantam AAA 3 years ago, a team I got by accident, and the nickname of one of the kids was Fur, F-U-R. And I was really hesitant to ask anybody how he got that nickname because at 13 he was shaving. So I asked him, how did you get that nickname, if I may ask? And he says, well, I've had a beard since I was like 11 or 12. And so the boys called him Fur. I was not going to call him Fur. I called him by his first name, and I've always called the players by their first name unless they said to me, it's okay to call me, Buster or, Rob Z or, whatever it was they came up with. But I always had a real problem and maybe it's the old-fashioned me and the teacher in me, but I always had a problem with coaches of the older players, like in junior in particular, who called the players by their nicknames on the ice or in the room. It just seemed to be bridging that. It's like when I see coaches on the bench in minor hockey with the, adults with the ball caps backwards. I'm going, you're not 14. Okay, let the 14-year-olds do that. I have a real issue with that. It seems silly, but they come or they're. It's like teachers coming to school in May wearing shorts. I get no, or flip flops. No, it's wrong. What are you going to do about it? As a former VP and department head, I'm not going to do anything about it. You just look like an idiot. Sorry, you're not 14. So I always felt that there needs to be that chasm that should not be bridged between coach player, teacher student. I remember in school there would be students that other students would call by their nicknames in class because they were the jocks. So all the basketball players knew each other. So, they knew that the 5 jocks in the class, you could call them by their nicknames. I went, no. His name is Paul. Her name is Susan. His name is Jack. Call them by their nicknames. Okay. That's just me. And did it work or not work? I don't know. You'd have to ask my former students and players, but I never wore a ball cap on the bench. And I never called them by their nicknames unless they expressly said, it's okay, you can call me Kingsy. So. And funny, I just saw that note about sending a vice principal home because I was also the union rep for about 18 years in Ottawa at the school I taught at, and I had a couple of incidents where teachers were called onto the carpet by the principal, and the teacher called for what they were wearing, flip-flops or whatever, particularly the females, and they called me in as the union rep to cover their butt. So I would sit there and listen, and then outside the principal's office, I'd say, the principal is perfectly justified. You dress however you want, but you've lost respect from admin and from me for dressing the way you are. Well, the kids like it. I don't care. You're the adult. We're the adults. We're the leaders. They're the kids. They're the players. I'm done now.
Anybody want to add anything? Jordan?
Wally, I can just add. I think it really depends on the environment you're trying to build, and I really liked Morris's take on the shorthand to communication. I think which was really insightful. I noted that Dave King always used nicknames in his communication with players, which is interesting. And then you can contrast that with how some coaches really want to set up a formalized type of communication in their teams, almost using yes sir, no sir, using last names, that sort of thing only. So it really, I think it depends on your team and on your culture that you're building. And again, to Morris's point last week, if you really want to get trust and buy-in from your players, that shorthand in communication by using nicknames that are appropriate and respectful may be an avenue to facilitate that communication. But on the other hand, if it erodes that trust and it takes away from concise communication, then you want to be able to maybe use first names or maybe even last names. So I think there's a real continuum there, and it's the art of coaching that we're talking about in terms of trying to get that concise communication and build trust and and shared leadership in your team.
I'd agree, Malcolm, that's probably comes right down to the respect side of things and asking your players or whomever you're working with what they would like to be referred as. And I do know that, of course, nicknames can be either that they're either terms of endearment or the opposite. And of course, you had nicknames of players on your own team, but sometimes I went back when I was playing, there were nicknames that you provided other players on opposition teams too, and things that people would use with them. And so, it's an interesting one. But as a coach, I think that it comes down to that whole piece of communicating in a respectful manner and communicating with them, like asking those questions. Are you okay if I hear people using this nickname? Where did it come from? And that piece. But I grew up. My community was next door to Viking, where of course the Sutter brothers all grew up. And I think that 90% of the people in that town had nicknames, and some of them ended up being called the junior of the nickname that their father had. And there were people that I, to this day, do not know their actual first name because it was never referred to in any time in anything that we were doing. So, so I don't know. It's a really interesting conversation, and that dress code thing, that's a hot button issue, and as we're moving towards the summer, that's one too. But I don't know what people's take is. I know that of course Don Cherry was always talking about what young players should look respectable coming to the rink, but does that mean a shirt and tie? Today, obviously, I'm not wearing a shirt and tie, and it's because of an activity we've got going on. The majority of the days I will in my work, because I guess the rule I go by with my staff is is one I borrowed from a mentor that said that when a person walks in off the street, they should be able to pick you out from another person that walked in off the street. You should look like you belong there and that you're somebody that they're entrusting your children or their children to. And as far as an administrator goes, well, then they should probably be able to pick me out of a lineup from a teacher. So I usually dress a little more formal than what teachers do. So the flip-flops and yoga pants and all of those things can tend to be an issue. And I always also go by the rule that the more casually you are dressed, probably the more casually you are taking everything about your day. So those are just my 2 cents.
Well, we've got 2 hands up, and Richard, I think yours was first. I'm curious about Morris. He was nodding his head to one of the statements, but Richard, go ahead first and then Morris. Or if you forgot to put your hand down, Richard.
I forgot to put my hand down. Sorry.
Okay. Go ahead, Morris.
I was reading the chat and I'm laughing. And I was actually going like this because I was chuckling about how this nickname, High Chair and Crib, because I know Carla. Know Carla. This is so funny. Haley was somehow more from wick to chick to chicken. And high chair. Oh my gosh. So now you know what? So in our talks, I'm changing the way I'm looking at this. Like I used the idea of names in order to build trust with the players. So the idea of the nickname for myself was to use it only when something really good happened, like a big play, a big hit, and it was to build the trust bond between myself and the player. And so the thing is that I would now, in player meetings at the start of the year, with each player, I would find out what their nickname is, if they want to tell me how they got it. And but then I'd ask for permission to be able to use it in an appropriate time. So just our discussions have made me aware that it would be good to get permission from the player first. So anyways, that's my thoughts. You know what, thanks very much. This was quite entertaining. Next time I see Carla, I'm going to call her Crib. Okay. See you guys. Thanks.
Bob, you spent quite a few years in the junior ranks. What was your take on that?
Well, I did use nicknames, but I didn't use nicknames that unless I knew the players were good with it. But I also would never use a nickname if I was having a one-on-one meeting with a player. That'd be a little bit more formal, so I would use their name. Like if I was going to have a meeting with Wally, I would call him Wally. I wouldn't call him Cozy. If I was making a line change, I'd say Cozy, you're up. I mean, that sort of thing. But I think a nickname should be an uplifting nickname unless it's something that's derived from a funny moment or something. But I don't think you want to give a nickname. Personally, I wouldn't want a player to have a nickname that is kind of derogatory or puts him down or puts his mind in some other place where, Jesus, I wish they wouldn't say that to me. You know, I've had, you all know Noodles on TV. Like, he had multiple nicknames. He was the most superstitious guy you ever seen, but he wanted to be called Noodles. It's plain and simple. And if I called him Jamie, he'd just give me this kind of a dumb look, like, come on, coach. Right? He wanted Noodles. So, you know, you got to kind of go with what I think the player likes or appreciates. But I would never, if I was talking to Noodles in a one-on-one, it would be Jamie. It would not be Noodles.
Kim.
Well, I like the discussion about like kind of game day apparel or coaching apparel. Like Richard, I'm a no hat person on the bench. I don't know where I got it from. It's just actually a lot of my coaches growing up wore hats, so I'm not sure what I have against it, but I'm a big believer in that. I also usually let my players pick their game day apparel, so what they wear to the rink on a game day. And, you know, it's a little different with the girls. They don't usually want to wear a, you know, suit and tie, and it often matters, you know, what color the team colors are, right? So there's teams in our league who, you know, are blue and yellow, and they want to wear khakis because it looks better than black pants or what have you. So, you know, I basically let them choose, and it's a way to build ownership that they, you know, they get to choose how they want to represent themselves. And I've never had them represent themselves poorly. Like they've never elected to wear tracksuits or running shoes. It always is a step above maybe even what I would wear personally. I'm pretty casual, as Sammy alluded to earlier. They're usually a step above that. So I think they see what they, you know, is in the NHL, and you know, I have had the occasional girl wear a skirt, but for the most part, they exceed what I would even necessarily choose for them or dictate to them. But they seem to do a great job of it, and it's just another way early in the season to increase the amount of ownership that they take of it. And you know, they'll call each other out on it if they're not, you know, meeting those expectations as the season goes on, and all those sorts of things. So it's something I, you know, other than the hats on the bench for the coach, and you know, and represent, you know, making sure you're wearing, you know, team colors. Other than that, I'm not too picky. But you know, I did want to address what Matt said about coach nicknames. And my experience with that is I don't usually get any. I usually am either Kim or Coach Kim, both of which I'm fine with. But it seems that the players who have more nicknames, as Bob was alluding to, right? Noodles has got a bunch of nicknames. I have one player who must have 7 or 8 nicknames. She's the one who always wants to call me by a nickname, ironically. Right? So the players with the more nicknames seem to want to dole them out a little bit more quickly as well. But yeah, I think it's what I always say is you promote, or what you allow, you promote. So if you're going to show up wearing a hat backwards as a coach, then you're saying that's okay for your players to do the same thing. And if you are going to use, you know, derogatory nicknames or inappropriate nicknames, you're also promoting that to your players. So that's an important piece that we always share with our players as well.
I also think you have to be careful with nicknames with smaller kids because parents get a perception of what that nickname is, and that can be not received very well. So I think you have to be a little bit careful. With boys in particular, they'll come up with nicknames that are probably not appropriate that parents don't need to hear. Right. So I think you have to be, as a coach, you have to make sure that you're filtering that out of the room as well.